Broadcast is live.
Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And tonight I am being joined by Dee Pierce, who is a host of Around the World with Brandy and Dee. We just did the Brandy and Dee show together at 8 o'clock this evening.
Yes.
Okay, and she is here with me again. And what we're going to talk about is the twilight of the deficit hawk, but gods, question mark. I don't know if they're really gods, but according to some reports, they're experiencing much more difficult times now than they once were. But I still don't know whether it's the twilight. Anyway, we're going to examine that question tonight through a number of, at least through a couple of articles we're going to go over and a couple of things we're going to recommend for you. So let's start, fittingly, I think, with a piece from The American Prospect by Dave Dayen, which gave me the topic for tonight. The title of that piece is, okay, let me make sure that I'm sharing it. The title of that piece is Twilight of the Deficit Hawks. And Dave Dayen, if you've forgotten, is the editor-in-chief of the American Prospect. The subtitle of this is Democrats Have Stopped Being the Willing Partner in a Great Conspiracy to Slash Social Insurance. And I do think that's right, as far as it goes. And he documents it in this very good article. That looks like it's Joe Biden doing his State of the Union speech to a joint session of Congress at the Capitol in Washington, February 7th, 2023. He begins, it wasn't so long that deficit hawkery was a dominant political identity in both parties. I can attest to the truth of that because I was blogging very actively in 2009 and 2010, and not so actively, but still some in 2008. And what a lot of my blogs were about was fighting with the deficit hawks. Okay, in early 2010, my blogging began to emphasize the MMT approach in fighting with the deficit hawks. I had learned about MMT at first, okay, in December of 2009. And in April of 2010, I began work on a conference called the Fiscal Sustainability Conference that ended up being a forum, okay, for MMT. because all of our panelists on that full day conference were MMTers. There was Bill Mitchell, Stephanie Kelton, and Warren Mosler. He was the luncheon speaker. And in the afternoon, okay, there was Marshall Auerbach talking on inflation and MMT views of inflation. And then the final session was one with Randy Ray and Pavlina Chernyova. It was a dynamite day, that conference. Most of the major objections to MMT were at that conference because there were many people in the audience that later became very prominent advocates, okay, for MMT. So that conference was an outstanding success, I think, in exposing MMT to the public. It took place on the same day as the fiscal conference. I forget exactly what that was called, that the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, okay, was putting on. Of course, ours was much smaller because we had about $5,500 to spend on the conference. Peter G. Peterson must have spent $500,000 on his conference that day. We were at George Washington University, and they were somewhere else in Washington at a more expensive place. But still, it was a great conference. Anyway, to get on to the topic right now, a significant chunk of Austerian but demigod Pete Peterson's fortune was spent. Was spent, and thousands of op-eds and thinly veiled news stories deployed to convince the public that fiscal deficits are a moral crime against future generations, that government budgets must operate like family budgets, and that caring about the long-run budget picture in 2096 was more responsible than worrying about whether existing seniors have dignity in retirement and the ability to afford their medications. The key to the success of this unpopular agenda was buy-in across the political spectrum. Politicians recognized that cutting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid would be hazardous to their career health. Sorry. But if both sides agreed with the proposition, they could diffuse responsibility by holding hands and plunging the austerity blade in together. The middle class would get screwed but not know who to blame. Well, I like that particular metaphor that he used there, but in those days, we're also talking about both sides holding hands and jumping off the fiscal cliff together. So, two telling metaphors. President Biden's jujitsu this week at the State of the Union address, effectively taking cuts to Social Security and Medicare off the table in future negotiations around the debt limit, reveals how this dynamic has been ended. The deficit hawks have lost nearly all their friends in the Democratic Party. Well, they've still got Kirsten Sinema. They've still got Joe Manchin, right? A significant sea change, and I think they've got another 8 closet deficit hawks inside the Democratic Party in the Senate. But anyway, have lost nearly all their friends in the Democratic Party, a significant sea change that makes a grand bargain to damage retirement security far less likely. I agree with Dave on that. It's far less likely than it used to be. But I don't know about the twilight of the gods, or if you like, the twilight of the demigods. We'll see about that. If you know where to look, you can see the angst this is causing. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the CRFB, a remnant of the deficit hawkery architecture first assembled during the 1990s, put out a statement this week accusing the White House of demagoguing the idea of a fast track deficit commission that would propose budgetary changes, including cuts to Social Security and Medicare, and get an up or down vote without amendments or the potential for a filibuster. By the way, Barack Obama was working with the Peter G. Peterson Foundation and also the CRFB to some degree in 2010 to try to facilitate that kind of commission. And that's exactly what they wanted to do then. The Fiscal Commission eventually got called the Cat Food Commission by the progressive outlets. And a vigorous campaign was set up against them. They had to get something like, there were 18 people on the commission, and they had to get something like 14 votes in favor in order to get some official recommendation to adopt certain deficit cuts that people on the commission wanted to recommend. But they weren't able to get the 14 votes. They weren't able to get 14-4. It was more like 12-6 or 13-5. So they couldn't have an official commission report because the rules that they were set up under required a 14-4 vote. Anyway, the heads of the commission who were Bowles and Alan Simpson, still wrote a report of their own. It was called the Simpson-Bowles Report because people had taken the name of the commission and begun to call it the BS Commission for Bowles and Simpson. So, of course, they were not interested in carrying that further too much, so they changed it to Simpson-Bowles. And the two of them issued a report, and there were other reports issued by other people on the commission, and the reports were different. Some of the progressive members of the commission issued reports which were not so deficit hawkish, but there were also a number of other people on the commission who issued pretty hawkish reports. I think there were 4 different reports that came out of the commission, but the victory was that there wasn't an official report that would have required some sort of action from the Congress. So, going on with the article, White House spokesperson Andrew Bates called the Deficit Commission idea a death panel for Medicare and Social Security. Thank you, Sarah Palin, for bequeathing to us the terminology death panel so we could use it in 2023, which CRFB president, that is Maya McGuinness, said, quote, demonstrates a lack of seriousness on this important issue. what I would say to her these days is that in the light of the discoveries, okay, of MMT, her position on deficit hawkery and budget deficits demonstrates a, a great lack of seriousness on budgetary issues altogether, because it demonstrates a huge degree of ignorance about how federal funding actually works going on. But who isn't serious? Given the current dynamics, virtually the entire Democratic Party, and at least rhetorically, the leadership of the Republican Party is on one side of the issue. CRFB, and I should add the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, which is now headed by Peter G. Peterson's son. Uh, anyway, CRFB is left with a handful of MAGA cranks, okay, on the other. Okay. The waning influence of the deficit hawks is one of the more dramatic changes in DC politics in the last decade. Uh, okay, I guess I agree with that, okay, except I was looking for changes over 2 or 3 years and fighting for changes over 2 or 3 years. So I wasn't very happy that it took over a decade, because it did take over a decade. We were all loudly calling for change in 2010 and 2011. And some of us hoped the platinum coin was going to get us there. But we've had to wait all this time for a serious dent to be made in the armor of the deficit hawks. Quote, the Austerians in Washington have trafficked in cruelty and racism, but they used to launder it through organizations with the veneer of fiscal responsibility. By the way, okay, this is a quote from Lindsay Owens, executive director of the Groundwork by Collaborative. And I guess I have to say to Lindsay that they're still using the veneer of fiscal responsibility to launder it through organizations. That hasn't really gone away yet. This Congress, quote again, this Congress has evaporated, and folks like Maya McGuinness are fully aligned with the policy demands of toxic elements like Matt Gaetz, who you all know is one of the lions of the Freedom Caucus in the House. We have to rename it the Unfreedom Caucus, of course, because it's freedom for me and not for thee. Freedom for the members of the Freedom Caucus and not anybody else. The reality of the Social Security and Medicare trust funds rarely comes up in these conversations. Social Security's issues can be permanently solved with a relatively small amount of money, about 1% of GDP. Due to inequality, nearly $1 in $5 of salary is exempt from Social Security payroll taxes, which are capped at $160,200 of income per year. That's the highest share of earnings exempt from payroll taxation in 50 years. Scrapping the cap brings back almost half the money needed to cover the shortfall, and applying it to capital income above a certain threshold would largely solve the problem. Of course, as we know, this is not a problem. This is a faux problem, which is created by the way most everybody looks at federal financing. But the way MMT looks at federal financing, the federal debt and the debt to GDP ratio both are no problem, because the level of the debt has no fiscal effect on the sustainability of spending. And the same with the level of the debt to GDP ratio. It's just not relevant. Why is it not relevant? Because the government is the currency issuer, and the government can always pay any debts that are due in dollars on a specific date. This is guaranteed by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and also by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, and also by some phrases in Article 9 of the Constitution. Anyway, scrapping the cap brings back almost half the money needed to cover the shortfall, and applying it to capital income above a certain threshold would largely solve the problem. The shortfall in Medicare is even smaller, 0.41% of GDP by 2050, according to the latest actuarial projections, which recognize that healthcare spending has actually been falling relative to GDP. I got to mention here also, though, it isn't part of the article. If we passed Medicare for all tomorrow in this country, healthcare spending would fall by much more, probably by 50%, which means that there would be no shortfall in Medicare funding. That would completely get rid of the shortfall going on. Further reforms on prescription drug prices will continue to whittle it down. The actual numbers in question have actually played less of a role in the political game. However, as the taunts from what Paul Krugman dubbed the very serious people used to work, I guess I have to say, I don't think it was Paul Krugman who invented the term very serious people. As I recall, the blogs in 2008, 2009, and 2010, that expression was all over the blogs as sort of a condemnation of what the deficit hawks were saying. Going back to the 80s and 90s, this is quote, there's always been this idea that the in-the-know people knew that we had to cut social programs, unquote, said economist Dean Baker, who has long swum against that tide. He has. He's a post-Keynesian economist. Quote, that's what responsible people did, unquote. Since the Carter administration nearly a half century ago, Democratic presidents have been comfortable with various iterations of this line of thinking. The era of big government is over, President Bill Clinton once said at the 1996 State of the Union address, and Barack Obama boasted of reducing spending to the lowest level since Eisenhower. Quote, Clinton and Obama and people in their administrations, they considered themselves responsible people. They always got applauded and were proud of it, said Dean Baker. The decades-old Peterson family of organizations and programs had been the primary voices doing the cheerleading. Peter G. Peterson, an investment bank and private equity executive and former Commerce Secretary under Richard Nixon, and also former president of the Bell and Howell Company, co-founded the Concord Coalition. That was during the 90s. How was it? Yeah, I think it was during the 90s. Just as Clinton took the White House, and Clinton named him to an Entitlement and Tax Reform Commission in 1994. Over the next 20 years, he spent $500 million through the Peterson Foundation to put together think tanks, research shops, ostensible news organizations, programs aimed at the millennials. One was called The Can Kicks Back, and other groups to encourage a deficit reduction agenda. A look at the board of directors of CRFB, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, one of the few entities in the Peterson orbit left. He died in 2018, reads like a roster of political royalty that is actually tilted towards Democrats. It includes two Clinton chiefs of staff, Erskine Bowles and former Obama Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, 11 former Democratic members of Congress, specifically Panetta, Tim Penny, Jane Harman, uh, there, okay, is Marjorie Margolis, David Ming, John Spratt, John Tenner, Dave McCart, uh, Dave McCurdy, and former Lyndon Johnson Chief of Staff James Jones, plus Ken Conrad and Chuck Robb, former Philadelphia member Michael Nutter, and Carter's Office of Management and Budget Director James McIntyre. To be sure, there are former Republican office holders on the board too, along with corporate executives and lobbyists, with plenty of revolving door overlap between all of those positions. Just a week before the State of the Union, CRFB released a document called Principles for Social Security Reform, unquote, pressing for, quote, benefit and or revenue adjustments as quickly as possible, unquote, and admonishing policymakers to, quote, reject partisan and special interest demagoguing. CRFB in this construction does not represent a special interest, not according to them, of course. At the same time, they offered a handful of options to improve solvency in various trust funds, including raising the requirement age for Social Security is 70. This is a curious proposal. There's already no set retirement age. Individual can take Social Security at any point between 62 and 70 with varying benefit levels for each. That serves mainly to mask what is a straight benefit cut. Economics professor Teresa Ghilarducci calculates the cut at 13 to 15% of benefits. Matt Brunig of the People's Policy Project puts it at more like 23%. The public, it should be said, is resoundingly opposed to such ideas. Even a majority of Republican voters don't want this outcome, that the public is not seen as the constituency for Peterson World's demands. Political elites are. If the elites can be swayed that cuts are the only responsible path without any alternatives, they will play their part in the game. In a statement to the Prospect, CRFB said, quote, the national debt is set to surpass its record as a share of the economy in just a few years due to rising spending, primarily from Social Security, Medicare, and interest payments on the debt, as well as insufficient revenue to pay for this spending. Everything should be on the table when it comes to preventing the debt from growing indefinitely. By the way, again, from an MMT point of view, it doesn't matter how high the debt grows. That has nothing to do with the fiscal sustainability of spending by the United States. That sustainability is always there as long as the United States remains a monetary sovereign, as long as it issues its own money, okay, as long as it allows, okay, its currency to float, and as long as it has no debts in currencies other than the dollar. As long as those conditions apply, it doesn't matter how big the debt gets. The federal government can always pay it off when it falls due. It can always pay off the interest on that debt, no matter how high the interest actually grows. So, what CRFB is saying to you, what the Peter G. Peterson Foundation has been saying to you, what the whole network has been saying to you, is based on a lie. The lie is that federal government financing is similar to household financing. And that lie completely ignores what the Constitution has to say about the federal government being able to create money. And it also ignores the reality that to this day, most of the high-powered federal government money that we see is created by the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. using the authority given to it by the Congress of the United States. Every time the federal government spends money into the private sector, it is new money that is spent into the private sector, new money that was given to the Treasury Department by the Federal Reserve based on certain triggers. We won't. I'll go through those triggers some other time in some other stream. But the important thing to note is that the origin of that money, of the reserves that the government uses to spend, the origin of that money in current practice is the Federal Reserve creating new money after tax settlements that destroy the old money, or bond settlements that destroy the old money. So, there's no such thing as insufficient revenue to pay for this spending. There may be insufficient tax revenue to pay for this spending. There may be insufficient revenue generated from borrowing to pay for this spending. But there is not insufficient revenue unless the federal government willingly declines to create any additional revenue which may be needed. Unfortunately for CRFB, the roster of Democratic budget cutters decidedly represents the politics of the past in Democratic circles. Pills. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I read that already. The desire to put aside politics and meet generational challenges is mostly confined to throwbacks like Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia. The White House has not shown the least bit of interest and has been openly hostile to Manchin's core idea, a fast-track deficit commission. To the extent Biden addressed deficits this week, he offered a throwaway line about the end of pandemic-era programs and called for a billionaire minimum tax. I like to think of it as Democrats returning to their roots, quote unquote, said Nancy Altman, founder of Social Security Works. You can still find plenty of Republicans who have expressed an interest in cutting Social Security. Thank you, honey. Welcome. Just yesterday, Senator Ron Johnson called Social Security a, quote, legal Ponzi scheme, unquote. By the way, I have a blog on that I wrote sometime in 2013 or 2014. Social Security ain't a Ponzi scheme in any sense. Trump's Vice President, Mike Pence, proposed partial privatization last week. Yes, that, by the way, is a ridiculous proposal that's been sort of it's been running around for at least 10 years, maybe more. But it was as ridiculous 10 years ago as it is now. Warren Mosler dismissed that idea in his 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds, one of the first of the MMT books. And the Republican Study Committee, as well as House Budget Committee Chair Jody Arrington, Republican of Texas, has bolstered the notion of a fast-track deficit commission. The problem for Republicans is that they have always wanted Democrats as willing partners, in no small part because then they could try to pin the blame on Democrats. Excuse me a second. In terms of actual principles, of course, the GOP doesn't care about deficits. Under every Republican president for the last 40 years, It has happily supported giant deficit busting tax cuts. Democratic rejection of deficit politics leaves Republicans politically exposed, and so their leadership is compelled to take it off the table and publicly announce that Social Security and Medicare won't be touched. Donald Trump wanting to use Social Security and Medicare as a wedge issue against Ron DeSantis, who was a Paul Ryan ditto head in Congress, is another factor. But even if that didn't exist, Republicans don't have the cover they need to slash social insurance. That puts CRFB in a lonelier place. The world Peterson created, the bubble he created, they're all still living in it, unquote, said by Nancy Altman. The problem for them is that world has shrunk. They're outside the legislative boundaries set up by Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, lingering on the same side as conservative bomb throwing think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, also Americans for Prosperity, and the American Enterprise Institute, a group with prior bipartisan credentials, is now on the edge of MAGA world. This hasn't stopped CRFB from churning out time warp policy ideas. Media house organs for deficit hawkery also remain stuck in that loop. The Washington Post editorial board continues to advocate for entitlement reform, quote unquote. But there's no true audience for this advocacy in the Democratic Party, which turns these previously affected pitches into nothing of consequence. While budget concerns, simply by virtue of the rise in chatter about them, have risen in prominence among the public, they still pale in comparison to the economy or health courts, and the mechanism to turn deficit hawkery into reality is missing. Republicans, as a result, have no real objective for debt limit hostage taking other than taking the hostage. Quote, it makes their effort transparently political, Dean Baker said. There's no coherent story that we have to do it, unquote. When Altman started her organization, Social Security Works, in 2010, she told me it was seen as part of the political fringe. She remains concerned that this dynamic could change on a dime, and I agree with her. That's the point. It could change on a dime. Though she thinks that the Biden administration calling a deficit commission a death panel makes that shift hard to accomplish, she's asking for Social Security expansion to drive the narrative even further away from hawkery. Of course, Senators Warren and Sanders are trying to drive the narrative even further away from hawkery as well by also calling for Social Security expansion. In the past, politicians were trying to do something the American people absolutely do not want, Altman said. Quote again, the argument in 2010 was, how big should the cuts be? I'm hoping in the future the conversation will be, quote, how big should the expansion be? So I'm worried about the turning on a dime. The reason why I'm worried about the turning on a dime is because the deficit hawks, whether this is their twilight or not, are making an awful lot of noise for organizations that are in their twilight period. But let me go to my next article, which is quite interesting from the point of view of what the deficit hawks are calling for and what is going on. And this article is by none other than Stephanie Kelton, who today, here we go. Okay, who today uh, was on Bree Joy Gray's program, providing an answer, a reply to the appearance, okay, on that program of Professor Rick Wolf.
That was excellent. It was an excellent broadcast.
And Stephanie did an excellent broadcast. Okay. Uh, I was so happy to see it and so thrilled with what she did there. What Steph did, she did great. Anyway, she had a very good thing in the Lens, her Substack blog, on February 4th. And her headline there was Danger Ahead. Mike Pence would pick up where Paul Ryan left off. As long as we play along with the quote solvency unquote game, Social Security is vulnerable to privatization. Yeah, Social Security is vulnerable to the deficit hawks. In other words, former Vice President Mike Pence is talking about privatizing Social Security. The remarks came Thursday before an audience at the National Association of Wholesaler Distributors Summit in Washington, D.C. Don't forget, Mike Pence is running for the presidency in 2024. He's already announced. Here's the comment that's raising a lot of eyebrows. I think the day could come when we could replace the New Deal with a better deal. Literally give younger Americans the ability to take a portion of their Social Security withholdings and put that into a private savings account. After seeing a video clip from the event, I tweeted, that is, Stephanie tweeted, because I'm back to reading from a piece. There she is on Twitter. When they say, quote, reform, unquote, they mean cut. When they say, quote, strengthen, unquote, they mean cut. When they say, quote, preserve, unquote, they mean cut. When they say, quote, protect, unquote, they mean cut. When they say replace, quote unquote, they mean replace. All in caps. By the way, am I sharing that? No.
Yes, I see it.
Oh, I am sharing that. Wonderful.
Yes.
I'm so glad. Okay, so going on, she puts hashtag Social Security down here. Uh, okay. So then Sahil Kapoor said, Mike Pence calls for Social Security reforms, including private accounts. Oh, I should say, that was a quote tweet of this tweet by Sahil Kapoor. Mike Pence calls for Social Security reforms, quote unquote, including private accounts for younger Americans. Quote, I think the day could come when we could replace the New Deal with a better deal, unquote, he says. Per video obtained by Tom LoBianco, news, yahoo.com, and then the rest, gay as ellipsed. I've been writing about this kind of thing for decades, says Stephanie. I can vouch for that because okay, I've seen her writing for some long time. And I dedicated, and some of my blog posts have been based on her writing, and I dedicated an entire chapter to Social Security in my book, The Deficit Myth. By the way, there was an entire chapter in Warren Mosler's Seven Deadly Innocent Frauds on Social Security also. In that chapter, I wrote about the following exchange between Congressman Paul Ryan, Republican Wisconsin, and the Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan. Mike Pence is just picking up where Ryan and before him George W. Bush left off. Click to watch the video and we'll break it down. And this is a very famous video because lots of MMT people have been sharing it for at least 10 years now. But anyway.
So having personal retirement accounts is another way of making a future retiree benefits more secure for their retirement? And also, do you believe that personal retirement accounts as a component to a system of solvency does help improve solvency? Because when you have a personal retirement account policy, it's accompanied with a benefit offset. With that feature in place, do you believe that personal retirement accounts can help us achieve solvency for the system and make those future retiree benefits more secure?
Well, I wouldn't say that the pay-as-you-go benefits are insecure in the sense that uh, there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to somebody. The question is,
Okay, did you catch that, folks? Did you catch that?
wants.
Yes, I did.
The question is, how do you set up a system which assures that the real assets are created, which those benefits are employed to purchase? So it's not a question of security. It's a question of the structure of a financial system which assures that the real resources are created for retirement as distinct from the cash. The cash itself is nice to have, but it's got to be in the context of the real resources being created at the time those benefits are paid, so that you can purchase real resources with the benefits, which of course are cash.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's it for that one. That's really a classic because what Greenspan does there is to grant some of the major claims, okay, of the MMTers, and implicitly he's even saying, okay, the limitation to spending is whether the real resources are there. That's the real constraint. Inflation is the real constraint, because if you don't have the real resources there or being produced, then you will have inflation driven by demand and also by inadequate supply, I might add. It's clear where the congressman wanted the Fed chairman to go. In a courtroom, I believe this is called, quote, leading the witness, unquote. In teeing up his question, Ryan used the phrase, quote, personal retirement accounts, unquote, no less than 4 times. Wouldn't it be a good idea, Paul Ryan asked, to begin to transition to a system of personal retirement accounts in order to help the Social Security system, quote, achieve solvency and make benefits more secure for future retirees? This is exactly what Pence is talking about doing. Ryan was hoping for a simple answer, yes, from Greenspan. Instead, he got the truth, quote, there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone, unquote. Read that again. Rewind the tape, says Stephanie. There is no solvency problem. What did I tell you before? No matter how high the debt is, no matter how high the debt to GDP ratio is, there is no solvency problem. There is not, nor can there ever be any financial difficulty in meeting payment obligations to future retirees, their dependents, and the disabled. Why? Asked Stephanie. As Greenspan explained in a speech in 1997, that all of these claims on government are readily accepted reflects the fact that a government cannot become insolvent with respect to obligations in its own currency. A fiat money system like the ones we have today can produce such claims without limit. To be sure, if a central bank produces too many claims, inflation will inexorably rise, as will interest rates, and economic activity will inevitably be constrained by the misallocation of resources induced by inflation. If it produces too few, The economy's expansion also will be uh, presumably be constrained by a shortage of the necessary lubricant for transactions. That's money. Authorities must struggle continuously to find the proper balance. It was not always thus. For most of the period prior to the early 1930s, obligations of governments in major countries were payable in gold. This meant the whole outstanding debt of government was subject to redemption in a medium, the quantity of which could not be altered at the will of government. Hence, debt issuance and budget deficits were constrained by the potential market response to an inflated economy. It was even possible in such a monetary regime for a government to become insolvent. As the lens of modern monetary theory, MMT constantly reminds us, the US dollar is no longer tethered to gold. The US is not operating under a fixed exchange rate system. We have a fiat currency and a floating exchange rate. It is impossible for the government to run out of money or to face bills coming due that it cannot afford to pay. Once you understand the nature of the monetary system we have today, it's easy to see why the arguments that people like Paul Ryan and Mike Pence are relying on to justify privatizing Social Security are totally without merit. Every Democrat should be able to explain this in very simple terms. We don't need to address the solvency crisis in Social Security because there is no solvency crisis. As Warren Mosler put it in a tweet, Warren B. Mosler, replying to @Stephanie Kelton. The Social Security trust funds are the accounting record of the difference between dollars subtracted from workers' accounts and dollars added to the accounts of the beneficiaries. There is nothing in them or not in them. Constraints on spending are entirely political. There's no money in them, as I've often said in this program, or not in them. They are an accounting record. Therefore, the Congress can, if it wants to, keeps on spending, even if the accounting record says that there's zero in the trust funds. Congress could just say to the Federal Reserve, please put another $1 trillion into the trust fund. When I say they could say that, I mean they can put that in legislation. When they pass an appropriations bill, they can add a sentence mandating the Federal Reserve to create the dollars attached to the appropriation in the federal spending account, the Treasury spending account, called the Treasury General Account, which is located at the New York Fed. Constraints on spending are entirely political. They involve the will of Congress. When Congress wants to end those constraints, it can do so, just like it can end the debt ceiling. In a little different way, ordering the Federal Reserve to produce the new money that Congress wants to produce. You don't have to subscribe to MMT to arrive at this understanding, Stephanie says. After all, Alan Greenspan got it, and I've written it numerous times before. Northwestern University professor Robert Eisner got it too. It's about inflation, not solvency. And by the way, Warren Mosler wrote a blog about that in 2010 in the Huffington Post, saying just about the same thing. What all of us, MMT economists, Alan Greenspan and Bob Eisner, understand is that the real challenge is, well, just that. a real resource challenge. Go back and listen to Greenspan's response once again after he tells Congressman Ryan there's nothing to prevent a currency issuing government from meeting its financial obligation to all beneficiaries, present and future. He goes on to make the really important point. The question he tells Ryan is, quote, how do you set up a system which assures that the real assets are created, which those benefits are employed to purchase, unquote. Think of it like this. We are an aging society. Each day, roughly 10,000 Americans reach the age of 65. As the elderly move out of the workforce and into retirement, they leave behind a smaller and smaller population of young workers who must produce the lion's share of the real goods and services that all of us rely on to meet our needs. Our national debate should revolve around our changing demographics and our economic productivity, not some red herring about Social Security's, quote, solvency, unquote. Imagine what would happen if we end up in 10, 20, or 30 years with a dwindling labor force and little productivity growth. Meeting our obligation to future retirees isn't primarily about sending them money each month. It's about helping them maintain a decent standard of living. And that can only be realized by having access to the real things they need: healthcare, housing, food, leisure, entertainment, etc. If Democrats and Republicans were having the right political debate, they would stop arguing about Social Security's, quote, solvency, unquote, start arguing about who has the better immigration plan and whose policies will do more to boost productivity, enhancing investments in the years ahead. For those interested in what it would mean to replace Social Security with a system of personal savings account, here's something I published in 2005 when George W. Bush was pushing the idea. And Stephanie cites a report of the Center for Full Employment and Price Stability in Kansas City, which she was at the university there in those years. So, she says, have a great weekend and thank you for subscribing to The Lens. So, that wasn't all from Stephanie Kelton for today's show. This afternoon, she was live with Bree Joy Gray in what was sort of a reply to what Rick Wolf had to say about the deficit, and the debt, which was strictly old-fashioned but neoclassical point of view. I had a stream, I think it was 4 streams ago or 5 streams ago. I believe it was on, I'm not sure the date, I think it was February 10th. I provided an answer to Bree and Rick Wolf's broadcast, at that time. I provided that because I didn't know that Stephanie was going to go on her program. And so, thinking that someone had to answer, I provided my own answer. But the important point here is that you should take in Bree Joy Gray's program today, because Stephanie was wonderful. She handled every question in a very vigorous and a very direct way. There was no dissembling of any kind. It was 1 hour and 12 minutes of straightforward answers to all kinds of questions. And it gave quite a lesson, in MMT to Bree. And I think it was a lesson that she badly needed. I think in her heart of hearts, she already knew that MMT was probably right, but she just didn't know enough about it to counter what Rick Wolf was saying when Rick was on a program. So she brought up all kinds of questions today for Stephanie, and Stephanie did a terrific job of answering them all. So I thought I would play a few things from this, but I don't really have anything marked off, so I'm not sure exactly where to go. Among other things, though, Stephanie does talk about the Social Security solvency issue being a false issue. She does say there is no Social Security no Social Security solvency problem, and she gives the reason why, which is specifically that it's political. It's up to the Congress. If Congress votes the money, year by year, Social Security will be just fine. The accounting record is no problem. What the problem is for people not to be hoodwinked by the accounting problem and keep demanding their Social Security from the Congress. Come what may, whoever is in political power at the time, you got to keep demanding that you get that Social Security that you paid into, that you earned. And you must never give up, okay, on that. Anyway, I highly commend this to you. It's in the YouTube description. It was a terrific performance by Stephanie. Okay, Dee was there too. Okay, and I believe that Dee totally agrees it was a wonderful performance.
Oh yes, yes. I was so happy that she was on and to be able to listen to her because I just love listening to Stephanie.
Yes, so do I. Okay, there's another thing I want to call to your attention before I say goodnight because our time is up, of course. There was an article that appeared in the Los Angeles Times. It's by Barry Hiltzik. I think his first name is Barry. I've read a number of things by him. Oh, I'm sorry, it's by Michael Hiltzik. Okay, I don't think that he's an MMTer, but he's friendly to it. He's been friendly to Stephanie on a number of occasions. Okay, anyway, he talks about Mike Pence's plan for personal accounts that he thinks would kill Social Security, and he says it will cost you. The key part of that article is on this unfortunately isn't really page numbered here, but it's about halfway into the article. He starts to criticize the idea, okay, of private accounts, and he gives various scenarios of what could happen if Social Security were turned over to private accounts. I've left a link to this, okay, in the description also. And this very well illustrates that even if the average return that Pence assumes were met over a period of time, that for the individual, there is no guarantee that the returns would be sufficient to out-earn the returns that you would get from Social Security. From Social Security, you're guaranteed a 3% return, okay, per year. Uh, but the return you get after, let's say, 45 years of work can be highly variable depending upon uh, having an anomalous year. It can throw off your whole average earnings. Okay, it can be very variable. Okay, uh, and it's not the same year for everybody. In other words, let's say someone has a personal savings account and they started to put their Social Security earnings in it. And it was their first year to put their earnings in it, and that year was a lousy year with a small return. That doesn't necessarily have to affect your average return that much, because there's plenty of time and plenty of years to make up for the amount of average return that you lost by having a lousy first year. But let's say that that year was your 45th year of paying into the program. That could really screw up your average, okay, in such a way that, well, he says, think of it this way. Let's say you start with 1,000 and this year you gain 100%. Now you have 2,000. But next year your portfolio falls by 50%. Your average return over the 2 years has been 25%. But you're back to where you started with 1,000. So your real gain is zero. That's your compound annual growth rate, or CAGR. And it's the only calculation that incorporates the rise and fall of volatile investments such as stocks. Remember, if you put your Social Security into a private savings account that was turned over to Wall Street to gamble with, that doesn't incorporate the rise and fall of volatile investments. Nothing they say would incorporate that, would tell you what the CAGR would be. Anyway, I recommend this article highly because the scenarios are very graphic and make clear the risk you take when you move from a Social Security account to a private account. It's not a risk that that many average earning people would like to take or should be taking if they want a measure of security, okay, in their old age. Anyway, it's an excellent article to illustrate the risk, so I highly recommend that. Okay. So I hope you liked this exposition tonight. I don't think we're in the twilight of the deficit hawk gods. They're out there right now, very actively, very, very actively uh, advocating for things like the privatization of Social Security and the privatization of Medicare of various kinds, various devices to privatize Medicare. They're out there constantly talking about the damage that will be done to our grandchildren unless we bring the debt under control. I've tried to point out to you here why the size of the debt is never any problem for the United States. I also tried to point out to you that the size of the debt to GB ratio is not a problem for the United States. Neither of those are solvency problems. I tried to point out to you that as long as the United States remains a monetary sovereign, it has no solvency problems or fiscal sustainability problems. It does have fiscal responsibility problems, those relate to whether we are spending for the public purpose or not spending for the public purpose. That is what is really at issue. Fiscal responsibility, not fiscal sustainability, not fiscal solvency. Okay, so Dee, any comments?
Um, we always have this every election season, or just every time they talk. You have the people with the privatization angle, and Social Security is just too strong. Everyone wants Social Security, and even when they talk about privatization, um, with healthcare, more people want Medicare for all or a government medical system. People see through privatization. And so many times I hear people saying that for small businesses, it would be beneficial to have a healthcare system that is government funded.
Yes, I completely agree with those comments.
Right. So there is more people what they want, but they're not being listened to, is what it boils down to.
Yes, they're not being listened to by the elites. Why are they not being listened to by the elites? Because the elites, the donors representing the elites, have bought the Congress, lock, stock, and barrel. As
Mhm.
many of you know who have been watching the Dump the Corruption programs that we have 3 or more times per week now, uh, no one from the Congressional Progressive Caucus has been able to pass the litmus test. They all especially take considerable PAC money. They all especially take money from individuals who can afford to contribute more than $200 to a campaign. In other words, taking money from wealthy or fairly wealthy individuals. And they also, when they can get it, love the contributions from outside spending groups, the super PACs and the carry committees. And of course, they love the support from the party committees like the DCCC. So every one of them so far, we must have done 60 so far out of the 95. Every one of them fails the litmus test, which of course is a measure of whether they've been bought by the interests, okay, or not. So we're saying in the most lefty part of the Congress, the part of the Congress where they're supposed to be most independent of money, they all fail the litmus test. They all reckon with and bow down to money from the interests. There may be a few saints in that group, but we have to build a system that works for everybody. We can't excuse the people who are saints from building that system because we don't know who's a saint and who's not. So, even in the area of the twilight of the deficit hawk gods, we come up against the corruption in Congress because they are out there. They're trying to see to it that we don't get Medicare for all, even though Medicare for all would lower healthcare expenditures by 50%, such that Medicare would no longer even be insolvent by their standards. Of course, it's not really insolvent. But the point is, even looking at it from their point of view, if we got Medicare for all, suddenly Medicare would be solvent as far as the eye could see. And they wouldn't be able to talk about it. So they have created the insolvency problem, the so-called insolvency problem of Medicare themselves by not passing the Medicare for all bill. They're responsible for the insolvency problem. And they want to put it on all the rest of us. You can't make this up. I'm sorry, do say again.
I said, no, you can't make this stuff.
You can't make this stuff up. We learn that every day.
Yes, we do.
Lana says, did you guys watch Stephanie on with Bree? Absolutely, absolutely. Lana says, hey, Kay. Kay says, I did, Lana. Hi, everybody. Hello, everyone. D here. Hi, Robert. We have a person in the state assembly that's going to try to get a wealth tax in California. Good idea, Robert. I don't think most politicians want Medicare for all. Whomever is interested in both the Fed and state healthcare programs, please join this group page. Meetings are open to all every Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern. I'm sorry, Lana, there's no link to the group, so please all hit the like button. Robert Coppin says, I don't like, but CNA wants as their champion, who CNA wants as their champion for CalCare, as it's Ash Kalra. Yeah, he was the guy who caved last year. CNA is the California Nurses Association, which of course is the chapter of the National Nurses. Kay says, scrap the crap. Lana says, please like this video. Lana says, I was also active in the chat with Stephanie and Bree. I was too busy listening to be active in the chat. But I'm going to go back and look for your comments, Lana. Oh, Lana says, I posted the link, but YouTube won't allow it. So can we see the link on Facebook then? Okay, I guess we probably can. Okay, everybody. I guess that about does it for tonight.
Like, share, subscribe.
Please like, share, and subscribe. And please like, share, and subscribe to Around the World with Brandy and Dee. Okay, as well. And please like, share, and subscribe to Revolution Evolution. These are the 3 live stream series that encompass our team.
Oh, hi, Jeffrey Denton just said hi.
Oh, hi, Jeffrey. Hey, Jeff, how are you? Great to see you. Kay says, night all, love you all. We love you too, Kay. You have a great night. And we'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow is Friday. We will have another session on giving the litmus test to Congressional Progressive Caucus people. Unbeknownst to them. Okay, Kay says scrap the cap. Yeah, I'm not even for scrapping the cap. I don't mind scrapping the cap. But what I'm for, of course, is just each year either paying for it with platinum coins or paying for it with overt congressional financing from the Congress. Just as a boilerplate sentence, okay, in the appropriations bill for it. So But scrapping the cap is fine too, because the people who make more than 160,000 can't afford to pay Social Security in the same proportion as all of us lesser folks. That would be more equal. And they're getting off easy, because if we scrap the cap, that would not even be progressive. In other words, everybody would be paying the same percentage, whether they were poor or whether they were rich. So they're getting off easy. That's not even progressive. Any other comments? Good night, folks.
Yes, good night.
Okay, could you stay for 1 second, Dee? Oh, she left.